In 1800, New York City was a cluster of about 60,000 people huddled at the southern tip of Manhattan, drawing water from polluted wells and lighting homes with whale oil lamps. By 1900, 3.5 million people lived across 5 boroughs, riding elevated trains, walking through a park engineered out of swampland, and crossing a bridge that hung from steel cable over open water. None of that existed at the start of the century. Every pipe, every reservoir, every iron column had to be planned, financed, fought over, and physically built by hand. I dug through municipal engineering reports, newspaper archives, and construction records from the period, and used advanced AI to reconstruct what it actually took to build the New York we recognize today. By the 1830s, New York City was drinking itself sick. Wells across lower Manhattan sat next to cesspools and graveyards, and outbreaks of cholera and yellow fever tore through crowded neighborhoods every few years. Fire was just as dangerous. Without enough water pressure to fight a serious blaze, entire blocks of the city had already burned to the ground. In 1834, the city formed a board of water commissioners to find a permanent clean water source, and the answer they settled on was the Croton River, more than 40 miles north of Manhattan in Westchester County. Construction began in May 1837 under Chief Engineer John B. Jervis, who had taken over the project after his predecessor was dismissed for poor planning. The plan called for a dam on the Croton River, a brick and masonry tunnel running the full 41 miles to Manhattan, and reservoirs to hold the water once it arrived. The tunnel was a horseshoe-shaped channel, about 8.5 feet high and 7.5 feet wide, designed to drop just 13 inches of elevation per mile, so that gravity alone, with no pumps or machinery, could carry the water the entire distance. Roughly 4,000 laborers, most of them Irish immigrants, dug the tunnel section by section through hills, swamps, and solid rock, while crews built 6 smaller tunnels and more than 100 culverts to carry the aqueduct across streams and low ground along the route. Water first reached Manhattan on June 22, 1842. Engineers marked the occasion by riding a small rowboat called the Croton Maid through the finished tunnel, taking the last stretch at a leisurely 2 miles an hour. The aqueduct fed 2 reservoirs built to hold it. One, shaped to resemble an Egyptian temple, sat on 5th Avenue, where the New York Public Library stands today. The other occupied the ground that later became the Great Lawn in Central Park. To finish carrying the water across the Harlem River into Upper Manhattan, engineers also built High Bridge, a stone-arched aqueduct bridge completed in 1848 that is still the oldest standing bridge in the city. In 1861, engineers added a second, much larger pipe across the bridge to keep pace with the city's growing demand. What strikes me most about the Croton Aqueduct is that it solved a problem nobody could see. It was only once Croton water started flowing into homes that doctors noticed disease rates dropping across the city, proof that the engineers had been right about a danger most New Yorkers never knew they were drinking. New York's obsession with cast iron began with a disaster. The night of December 16, 1835, 17 blocks of Lower Manhattan burned to the ground, 670 buildings in a single night. City officials pushed hard afterward for construction methods that would not burn so easily, and inventor James Bogardus offered a solution. Instead of carving stone facades by hand, builders could cast columns, arches, and entire decorative storefronts out of iron at a foundry, then bolt the prefabricated pieces directly onto a building's frame on site. The approach spread quickly through the neighborhood now known as SoHo during the 1850s and 1860s. A single mold could be reused to stamp out dozens of identical columns or cornices, which meant elaborate Italianate facades that once required skilled stonemasons working for months could now be ordered and assembled in weeks. The hollow iron columns also let architects open up interior floor plans and install far larger windows than load-bearing stone walls would allow. One of the most famous examples, the Howat Building at Broadway and Broome Street, opened in 1857 with cast iron columns styled after a Venetian palace, and inside it housed the world's first public passenger elevator, installed by Elisha Otis using a safety brake he had only recently invented. Otis would later refine that same elevator brake to help make true skyscrapers possible. Builders marketed cast iron as fireproof, and the iron itself genuinely did not burn. The floor joists and ceiling beams hidden inside the walls, however, were still ordinary wood, and that gap between appearance and structure stayed invisible for almost a century. It surfaced in 1958, when a fire on Worcester Street burned through one of these buildings and killed 6 firefighters, finally proving that a fireproof shell was never the same thing as a fireproof building. By then, SoHo already held the largest concentration of cast iron facades anywhere in the world. Before Central Park existed, the 843 acres set aside for it were considered the worst real estate in Manhattan. The ground was a mix of swamp, bare rock outcroppings, and tanneries that dumped waste straight into the bogs. A small community called Seneca Village stood on the park's west side, home to roughly 264 residents according to the 1855 census, many of them free black property owners alongside German and Irish immigrant families. In 1857, the city used its power of eminent domain to clear the land entirely, forcing out every resident to make way for the park. That same year, Frederick Law Olmsted was hired as superintendent of construction, and he soon partnered with architect Calvert Vaux on a design called the Greensward Plan, which the park commissioners selected the following spring. Turning the design into reality meant rebuilding the land from the ground up. Crews drained the swampy lowlands into the lakes. Visitors skate on today, while workers blasted through stubborn outcroppings of Manhattan schist using a combined 166 tons of gunpowder, more explosive force than was fired during the entire Battle of Gettysburg. Nearly 3 million cubic yards of rock and soil were carted out of the park by horse-drawn wagon. More than 20,000 laborers cycled through the project over its 9 years, with as many as 4,000 working the site at once during peak periods. 2 large reservoirs built to support the city's water supply ended up swallowing roughly a fifth of the park's total area, a trade-off Olmsted had to design around rather than fight. Construction dragged on for years longer than planned, and costs ballooned to nearly $14 million against an original budget of $1.5 million. Skaters were using the frozen lakes by the winter of 1859, but the park as a whole was not declared finished until 1873, when the Bethesda Fountain was unveiled at the heart of the Greensward Plan's central terrace. Land bordering the park had been worth about $26 million the year before construction started. Once the park was finished, that same property had climbed to $236 million. A return that quietly answered every commissioner who had once called the spending reckless. New York's streets had become a victim of the city's own growth by the late 1860s. Horse-drawn streetcars and wagons crawled through traffic backed up for blocks, and there was no open ground left at street level to build anything faster. Engineer Charles T. Harvey proposed building the railroad vertically instead, hanging a single track on an iron framework roughly 30 feet above Greenwich Street. After running a small test section in 1867, funded by about $100,000 in subscriptions, Harvey staged a public trial run on July 3, 1868, with a car that reached 15 miles an hour gliding above the crowded street below it. The first version of the line ran on cable rather than a locomotive. Stationary steam engines hidden in the cellars of buildings along the route pulled a continuous loop of cable that dragged the cars forward, a system that looked clever on paper but broke down constantly in practice. By 1871, the new owners had replaced the cable system with steam locomotives that pulled the cars directly along the elevated track, a far simpler and more dependable setup. Once steam power proved the concept worked, competing companies raced to build more lines. Crews erected elevated tracks above 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, and 6th Avenue through the 1870s, bolting together iron columns and girders over streets that were never designed to be built above. By 1878, trains were running along 6th Avenue, and within a few more years, the separate companies running these lines had folded into a single operator, the Manhattan Railway Company. None of it came without cost to the streets below. The structures blocked sunlight, made nearby buildings shake whenever a train passed, and rained hot ash and cinders down on pedestrians and shopkeepers walking underneath. A blizzard in 1888 paralyzed the elevated lines along with the rest of the city, pushing officials to start planning an underground subway instead. Even so, by the early 1890s, the elevated lines were carrying nearly 200 million passengers a year, more people than the city's streets alone could ever have moved. No structure on this list demanded a higher price in human suffering than the Brooklyn Bridge. Engineer John A. Roebling designed the bridge to span the East River on steel cable, but he never saw construction begin. While surveying the site in June 1869, his foot was crushed against a piling by a docking ferry, and the resulting tetanus infection killed him within weeks. His 32-year-old son, Washington Roebling, inherited both his father's design and the job of building it. When it opened, the finished span measured nearly 1,600 feet, the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time. Work started in January 1870 with a problem no American engineer had solved at this scale before: how to lay foundations for two massive towers on the bottom of a busy tidal river. The answer was the pneumatic caisson, an enormous airtight wooden box, open at the bottom and sealed at the top, sunk into the riverbed and pumped full of compressed air so workers inside could dig out mud and rock while staying dry. The Brooklyn side caisson reached a depth of 44.5 feet before hitting solid ground. The Manhattan side was a harder fight. Workers dug to 78.5 feet without striking bedrock, and Roebling, worried about the toll the depth was taking on his men, made the call to stop digging and let the tower rest on compacted sand instead. That decision came only after Roebling had already paid for the project with his own body. In December 1870, fire broke out in the timber ceiling of the Brooklyn caisson, and Roebling spent nearly a full day and night inside, fighting it, before ordering the chamber partially flooded to put the blaze out. Washington Roebling collapsed in 1872 while overseeing the deeper Manhattan caisson because of the same condition doctors eventually named caisson disease, and we now know as decompression sickness, caused by men surfacing too quickly from the pressurized air below. For the rest of construction, he directed the project from a window near the site, watching progress through a telescope, while his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, carried his instructions to the engineers and workers in person and quietly took on much of the bridge's day-to-day management herself. The bridge opened on May 24, 1883, after 13 years of work and at least 27 deaths among the men who built it. Emily Roebling rode across first in a carriage, and President Chester Arthur attended the public dedication that followed. Washington Roebling watched it open from his window. He never set foot on it. The Statue of Liberty arrived in New York Harbor in 1885, but it had nowhere to stand. France had agreed to build the statue itself, while the United States was responsible for the pedestal underneath it, and American fundraising for that pedestal lagged for years behind the French side of the project. In 1881, architect Richard Morris Hunt was commissioned to design it, and his original plan called for a pedestal towering 114 feet, scaled back to 89 feet once it became clear the money simply was not there to build something larger. Once finished, the statue and pedestal together briefly stood taller than the Brooklyn Bridge towers that had opened 3 years earlier. Construction fell to engineer General Charles P. Stone, who broke ground inside the walls of Fort Wood, a star-shaped fortress built on Bedloe's Island decades earlier on May 11, 1883. The foundation alone required 27,000 tons of poured concrete, the largest single concrete mass attempted in the country up to that point, and it took a full year to complete. Once the concrete foundation was finished in May 1884, crews began facing the pedestal above it with granite shipped down from a quarry on Leeds Island in Connecticut. the same source that had supplied the granite for the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge a few years earlier. Then the money ran out completely. Work on the pedestal stalled for roughly 5 months in 1885, while the statue itself sat disassembled in 214 wooden crates on Bedloe's Island, fully built and waiting for a base that did not exist yet. Newspaper publisher Joseph Pulitzer stepped in with a public fundraising campaign through his paper, The New York World, appealing directly to ordinary readers rather than wealthy donors. Tens of thousands of small donations poured in from across the country, and within months, Pulitzer had raised enough to finish the job. Workers set the final capstone into place on April 22, 1886. Once the pedestal was finished, crews spent the rest of that year reassembling the statue itself on top of it, bolting together pieces that had been shaped and fitted half a world away in a Paris workshop. The whole structure was dedicated on October 28, 1886, in front of President Grover Cleveland and a crowd that filled the harbor with boats. By 1900, everything built in the previous 100 years was already under pressure. The Croton Aqueduct, designed to last a century, had been joined by a second larger system before the century was even out. The elevated railways carrying 200 million passengers a year were already being reconsidered. Within a generation, they would be torn down and replaced by tunnels running beneath everything built above them. The Brooklyn Bridge, the longest span in the world on the day it opened, had 2 neighbors crossing the same river before 1910. The city consumed its own infrastructure as fast as it could build it, and then demanded more. That pattern didn't slow down, it accelerated. What the next century built on top of what you've just seen is another story entirely, and one worth telling. If that's the kind of deep dive you're here for, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what city or era you want next. I'll see you there.